Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Metacast by Naavik, a podcast in which we explore the business and future of video games. I'm Aaron Bush, co-founder of Naavik and your host today, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined by Raph Koster, a legendary game designer, author, and currently founder and CEO of Playable Worlds. Raph, thank you so much for joining.
Oh, my pleasure. Looking
And I
forward
also
to it.
want to thank thank our Naavik team and community on Discord for suggesting a bunch of questions. Naturally, with the details of Playable World still being largely unannounced, we respectfully won't dig as deeply into that today. Although I still have a few questions, and we'll be spending most of our time talking about game design, MMOs, and the challenges of building digital worlds. So, first off, Raph, you've accomplished a lot in your career so far. Ultima Online, Star Wars Galaxies, many other games. But looking back, what is the one thing that you're most proud of from your career as a game designer so far, and why?
Oh, I'm probably proudest of games that most of the world has never seen, because they never came out, or they're sitting here in prototype form. I'm probably proudest of things like not the games, but the impact the games have had on people. Because when you look at the actual games, I go, oh, look at all that stuff that was busted. um, I'm probably proudest of a lot of the writing that I think has ended up having an impact in terms of helping other game designers do what we do. And I think, that is probably in some ways the actual lasting work, right? Not necessarily what you do, but what others do given what you did, if that makes sense. So in some ways, the books and things like that probably will last longer than the games.
Mm. And that's a great segue to the next question, actually. A bunch of people at Naavik are grateful for your book, A Theory of Fun for Game Design, which, influenced their development and passion as game designers. A couple of people on the team were wondering, how has your theory of fun changed over the past decade or so since publishing? If you were to revisit the book today, what are some things that you might include that you didn't before?
So, it's actually closing in on 2 decades, actually. Yeah, I think it's what, 22. So that means the book is 18 years old. I actually did do a revised edition at the 10th anniversary. It came out in 2015, I guess. So technically the 11th. Um, and in that, I think the biggest changes, other than updating the science, were probably looking at the ways in which people play games that aren't necessarily for fun. Things like playing games for meditation or playing games for um, almost like competitive sport. Competitive sport is often not particularly fun. It's grueling and exhausting. Um, so other ways to play games that aren't necessarily about having that sensation of fun through learning, which is what I really talked about in the book. Um, if anything, over time, more and more science, more and more theory, really, as well, has sort of converged on pretty similar ideas, right? Um, a lot of the science around things like deliberate practice, for example, wasn't really widely known at the time that I did the original draft of the book. And so, as stuff like that has come out, it's in most ways reinforced quite a lot of what theory of fun says. Um, there have been some lovely nuances added over the years by folks who've sort of run with the ball in more directions. In particular, I think of Aaron Hoffman John's notion of Sophia as a concept around what is the step beyond just fun as learning, that I thought was actually a really, really lovely elaboration. Um, Honestly, I wish there were more books about fun out there. There's it's sort of weird that there haven't been more written over the years. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, honestly, for the Naavik audience, I would say stop reading Theory of Fun and go read Postmortems instead, because it probably has more directly applicable lessons to what I think a lot of the Naavik audience is particularly interested in around, the future of online worlds.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. Another question, from the team was, not just like looking back, what would you change or add to the books, but just recognizing that the industry, I mean, currently, is evolving quite a bit, but that it always has. And you've been someone who has successfully evolved as a game designer over a good stretch of time. And so I'm curious, like, how do you recommend evolving as a game designer? As gaming business models and platforms and technologies change, like how do you recommend embracing all of this change and upskilling to better navigate the future? How have you done it in the past, and how would you recommend people think about that for the future?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's really easy to always fall back on what you know, right? And it's a human tendency. We all do it. We all reach for whatever tools were already on our workbench. I think it's important to embrace the idea that you want to always be adding new tools to your workbench, to embrace the idea that you can't stand pat and that the tools you have are enough. Um, so, as a game designer, what I typically recommend is um, reading widely in varying fields, because those things end up giving you new tools for the workbench, right? You start seeing analogies between different areas of study that help illuminate problems or help give you different angles or views on things. Um, Ultima Online was partly inspired by MIT robotics experiments putting light sensors on roller skates and a servo to drive them around to make artificial cockroaches, right? That doesn't sound like it would have led to a core concept in Ultima Online, but it did. Galaxies had a lot of influence from reading in um, network science. Graph theory and network science was a core element of what shaped the design of Star Wars Galaxies. So, you never know where something like that is going to end up getting you to push outside of your box, right? And kind of, explore an area that you're not comfortable with. I think always being willing to try out whatever the new platforms, or at least dig into them, because platforms force you to question and relearn, right? It's a good thing to find yourself in a situation where your old tools don't work, right? Um, the best analogy I can think of is actually when I'm playing guitar, right? Um, uh, Tuning the instrument to random weird new tunings means you forget all of it's not that you forget, all of your old fingering, all of your old chords don't work, and it makes you reapproach the problem. Hey, I want to get some music out of this, or I want to get an arrangement of this particular tune. By having changed the way you address the problem, you find new solutions, right? You find different ways in. Um, to me, that's why things like all of the writing and exploring I've done around game formalism, right? It's because I've been trying to find the music theory that is underneath playing the guitar, right? Because if you master the music theory, then the instrument won't matter as much. You can come at it in different ways. Um, and that's really what game design theory is about, is trying to find what's the equivalent of music theory that makes games work. And if you're chasing down that, it's a bottomless pit, right? And so
Hmm.
it forces you to always be, questioning your previous assumptions and figuring out new ways to do things. So, it's going to be boring, but the answer is try to always be learning, put yourself in unfamiliar situations.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And on I would imagine that other people at the tops of other fields too would actually give really similar advice to study widely, because a lot
Yeah.
of understanding the fundamentals of a lot of areas, whether it's psychology or computer programming, whatever it is, it all connects together in really interesting ways. Just to double click on that question a little bit, is there anything that you're studying right now or running across right now that you think is particularly interesting, or is being productive to your job building games, and in a way that maybe others wouldn't think?
Lately, I've been spending a lot of time revisiting economics questions. Um,
Hmm.
uh, you know, um, it's prompted by a lot of what's gone on with Web3. It's prompted by doing economy design on the game we're working on, but it's also prompted by the real world. It's prompted by um, looking at things like, uh, oh, I don't know, Piketty's book on economics, right? And stuff like that, and saying, okay, what are analogies that we can draw between, Gini coefficients and index in the real world and political instability, and what does that mean for balancing soccer, right? Like literally connecting it that way, because um, I've basically been looking at the way in which uh, I guess in economic terms, we'd call it wealth, right? Looking at accumulation within a given context, what are the dynamics that cause it, right? What are the economic structures that end up affecting how it develops, how quickly, how slowly? It in games we work against things like runaway inflation in the games, for example, right? So you know, I think many of us who worked in MMO economies called out that Axie was headed for very serious economic troubles sometime around the, middle of last year. We said, oh, this is going to go bad, right? And it's because we were reaching back to some of those core principles. Um, I think the interesting thing is where it starts affecting game balance questions, where it starts shaping how we tackle things like, how do you design your drains, how many currencies should you have, what is the acquisition impact of having a high Gini coefficient in your game, right? Like if your wealth distribution goes Pareto, does that make the game have worse newbie conversion? And the answer appears to be yes, right? Um, so then let's talk about, I've been doing things like building models with, if there's only 10 coins in the game, what happens under these different situations, right? In order to try to arrive at sort of general principles.
Gotcha. That's super interesting, and we'll dig more into some of your thoughts about economies and digital worlds more later. But before we get too deep into the weeds, I do want to talk about playable worlds for a moment. And as I said, I know we can't go into too much depth, but I do want to ask, just for starters, what is the mission of Playable Worlds, and what can you tell us about what you're building right now?
I would say that the mission of Playable Worlds is to fulfill the potential of what online worlds can be, right? That's what we want to do. Um, Now, there's a lot of possible potentials. um, so we're obviously chasing the potentials that we see. I would like online worlds to be, a place where different groups come to understand one another, a place where we can experiment and work together to solve group coordination problems that maybe help make a difference in the real world. I would like online worlds to be places of identity exploration where we come to know ourselves better, right? They're really they're not just a public square but a lab for experimentation, right? But they're also a place of escape, and I don't denigrate escape. I think escape is important and valuable, and without that escape, that self exploration can't really happen, right? So at the high level, that's our philosophical mission. In terms of what that means, in terms of what we're building, right? First is we want to make online worlds actually work the way the rest of the modern internet does, rather than using effectively a decades old, very rigid client server model, right? We want to do something that um, plays better with the internet today. So many dreams about what the metaverse can someday be are really gated by the fact that um, we've essentially been architecting MMOs for quite a while in a very game industry way, if that makes sense. They've been very much structured in the way of, they're still structured as if we were delivering a silver platter to your house in a box, right? And that's not even the way the game industry works today. much less everything else, right? Everything else is much more alive and dynamic. So when we
Mhm.
dream of a metaverse, it's super clear that it needs to include elements such as on the fly dynamic updates, far less reliance on static content, much more on dynamic content delivery, um, less emphasis on the concept of content, period, in some ways, right? Um, More ability for there to be a two-way connection between players and the game. Um, uh, More leveraging of the amazing power of simulation and the power of the cloud, right? Than what we do now, right? I often analogize it to we keep building worlds like we're doing building the stage for a high school play, right? We make a whole bunch of cardboard backdrops that only look real if you're far enough away, and the minute you get close to them, you go, that's not. This is an inch deep. It's not real.
Mm.
It doesn't have much substance to it, and that limits what developers can do, and it limits what players can do, right? And that limits the potential of what online worlds can be. Um, Ironically, back in the text days, streaming text over a telnet connection was a fully streaming client, right? And in some ways, as graphics came in, we've gone backwards, right? There's more
Right.
and more, like, right? We stuff more and more in the cache, so to speak, and ship it to you in advance, and then it doesn't change. It can't evolve. It can't grow. Years ago, I wrote a lament where, great, we're making these gorgeous, beautiful worlds. I'm walking through a meadow and there's music playing and a forest in the background and bunnies hopping around, but I can't pick a flower. The flowers don't grow, seasons don't change, people can't change, right? Like, we even designed it in so that people can't really grow and evolve. We let you get more hit points and kill bigger monsters, but it's not really set up to allow growth and change in so many ways, right? um yeah, the dreams of metaverse that people have, the stories that people tell about metaverse are all about growth and change. So to me, that's the big thing to overcome.
Right. And in a post last year, you wrote, "We have built a metaverse platform." Again, I know you can't dig into
Yeah,
details, but at a high level, like, what can you tell us about what that means and how that ties into your vision for the future of games?
sure. Yeah, I hope people don't mind if I get moderately techie, right?
Please do.
Yeah, so specific examples from what I just listed, right? When I have an older car, it has a GPS system where the maps were actually on a DVD in the dash, right? Um, That means this car is over a decade old. The maps have never changed. That reminds me of playing MMOs. So, one first thing is, let's have an environment that allows for streaming down of game content and game assets as players move around in the world, right? Um, and that doesn't necessarily seem that revolutionary until you realize that most games don't do it. Roblox does it, as to
Hmm.
pick one example, but most games simply don't. The ability to deliver content on the fly, the ability to say this environment, this map is not a static handcrafted mesh, but is actually data. And that we're going to have the client parse the data and represent the data to you in whatever way makes the most sense, which is different from saying we're going to decide how you see things. We're going to decide how this looks. Um, so part one of it has to be that the client has to grow thinner. It has to become something that has fewer assumptions about what it is connecting to. And typically those assumptions come mostly in the form of the assets and the meshes and the static content. So sending that down on the fly, that's step one to truly building a metaverse platform. Step two is driving things more completely from the server, right? That is crucial, right? Um, Again, when your client has baked in assumptions, right? It's sort of the difference between a browser and an app, right? An app is dedicated towards one purpose. A browser is architected and designed from the beginning to be able to receive varying forms of content and provide varying forms of experiences, right? If you're trying to build a metaverse platform, you have to build that way, right? A Roblox client does not assume that you are connecting to a 2D platformer.
Mhm.
Most MMO clients assume you're connecting not just to a standard MMO, but to that one specific MMO, right? I often use the analogy that way back when in Australia for a while, each radio station sold radios without a tuner dial. And so when you got that radio, it could only tune in the one station. That's how our online world clients today tend to work. They can only tune in the one station. Driving things from the server and architecting your client so that it isn't locked down in that way is also a key element of actually building a metaverse platform. So we have done both of those things. There's a ton of wrinkles in terms of what that means, because you also don't want to go building a custom server per experience. So that means that your server also has to be fully data driven, including the ways in which your game logic operates, right? Um, and then for larger scale dreams, you really need it to be a citizen of the web, right? The entire web today, all of our internet that we use on a daily basis is built around a whole set of standards and conventions, and games blithely ignore them, frankly, right? Um, so if you dream of pulling off things that, frankly, are not that hard and have been done dozens of times, but everybody brings them up. Oh, we want to have a live concert, or oh, we want to have an Amazon storefront you can walk around in, or whatever. Come on, your server should be able to speak web. That shouldn't be like a custom integration. Just speak web, right? Setting up a live audio feed is no big deal. Tens of thousands of people do it every day, setting up internet radio stations, right? Like, it's not that whack, right? And yet, when we look at especially now that we have so many new entrants into this metaverse space, people are really impressed that they got a canned audio stream. It's like, come on, right? Like the first full bi-directional interactive live concert, Suzanne Vega did it in Second Life in like the early 2000s, and the audience could talk to her and she could talk back, and like, anyway, setting up your architecture in such a way that it can actually leverage this giant plethora of stuff that's out there, um, that's also a key thing. All of these things do call for architecting your tech in a way that's very different from how games are typically built, right? That it's not at all the way that engines want to work. For example, the commonly used engines, it's not the way, it calls for a different networking model than the standard replication networking model that everybody uses, right? Which is why we keep having folks get surprised over, wait, you can get more than 250 in a space, or think of 250 as being a big achievement, when we've had we've had 4 digits worth of people on a server process for literally decades.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's all of those things, right? It really requires you to architect and think about this from the bottom up. Luckily, we've done it before, because we built a platform like that starting in 2006 with my previous startup, Metaplace.
Mhm.
And Metaplace was actually a direct competitor of Roblox's, and Roblox and Metaplace actually extremely similar in a whole bunch of their architecture. So it's not that there aren't proof points out there. There are plenty of lessons to be had. Um, we're just observing them and innovating on them.
Mhm. Yeah, well, thank you so much for sharing all of that. And I know I and many people listening can't wait to see more details about what Playable Worlds is spinning up, how it's going to work, like exactly how some of those architectural differences play out. Maybe to ground it a bit more, a bit less technical, maybe more from like a player lens, and specifically with MMORPGs. Like, you know, because of all of these architectural differences, like from a player lens, like what are the key tenets that will separate the great MMORPGs of the future from those of the past?
Oh gosh, there's a whole bunch. And not all of them are only driven by the tech, but the tech enables features that enables social things. And that's how I'd put it. Because I would say that really the things that will differentiate are going to be social. But it's hard to get those social things without building on top of features that are enabled by tech, right? So um, I'll pick one example that's fairly easy to trace, right? Um, in in most MMOs, you can't have a house. But in the ones that you can, mostly you get a virtual instance. You have an instance of a house, or there's this vanishingly small quantity of houses that the designers pre-placed and said, well, you can get in line and hope you get to claim one someday, right? Why is that? Partly it's because the tech doesn't really allow people to build. If you look at that, right, alone, what does building require? It requires those things like asset streaming, treating the map as data, not making everything out of meshes, and so on, right? So there's a technical underpinning there that enables, hey, we want to be able to have freestanding structures in the world. Now, there are challenges around freestanding structures becoming cluttering up the map because you have limited amount of map. But limited amount of map is also a restriction because of handcrafting everything in the first place, right? So there's that. But if you even think about what does limited amount of map mean? I mean, in real estate, that's location, 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 right? So there's social dynamics that stack on top of the ability of building freestanding structures in the world. If you don't have that, then your real estate market is incredibly simplified, right? Because it can't have the variability that exists from location, from traffic, from um, you know, locality, right? Like
Mhm.
the idea of a suburb versus not can't exist if everybody has instanced apartments, right? So there's an enormous amount of important social dynamics that are outgrowths of this stuff, even when you look at it at a tech layer, right? Um, Now, from a gameplay point of view, if you want to make that super concrete, it means, hey, you can be an architect and design the house the way you want. You can put it to different uses. You can, maybe you can build an inn at the coolest crossroads because you're actually at a crossroads where people walk, right? Like the dynamics that evolve from that eventually become things like, wow, you and your friends could found a town, right? And now we're unlocking higher order things that are the sorts of things that are in Sword Art Online or whatever other metaverse thing you want to go reference, right? But if you don't have that substrate, you just can't get there, right? Like there's no way to get there with an instance department. There are many many examples of gameplay things like that if you don't have a substrate like that, you just can't do. um, Events is a really really simple thing, right? The amount of effort it takes to make an event when you have crafted your entire world out of static content pieces is enormous, and you are unwilling to make permanent changes because it's sunk costs that you don't want to erase, right? So what happens to the gameplay experience when events are dramatically easier to make? And we actually know because we can go look at past examples of worlds that had more dynamic structure that could actually provide, just not just freedom, but more opportunity for developers to do things on a faster basis, right? Even from a business point of view, a platform like that enables you to update more often, be more responsive to customers, bug fix more rapidly, right? And like from a raw biz point of view, we know frequency of updates is one of the key determinants of retention and therefore revenue, right? So yeah, it has enormous cascading effects, many of which are just right up front. A player can feel them and see them, right?
Yeah, maybe I was naive. I definitely am, but I guess I was sort of surprised to hear you say that some of the like many of the biggest differences will be social driven. Could you maybe just share like one or two more? We don't have to go through like the full reasoning of how the tech leads to it, but just like a couple more examples of like just socially, like what are a couple other things that could be possible in the future because of all the things that you're building and thinking about that weren't before.
Sure. I'll give you a historical example first, because then you can extrapolate out. And that way I don't have to give away too much about what we're doing.
Sounds good.
Way back in Ultima Online, which is now like, what, 25 years old, right? Way back on Ultima Online, it was a big deal that we allowed you to change the clothes on your character. Okay, we were one of the first games on Earth to let you do that at all. But we didn't just let you change the clothes on your character. We also allowed tailors to make dyes, and those dyes could then tint the colors of your clothing. You could re-dye your outfit, right? That, on the face of it, already that implies a technical substrate that says we want to allow this to be server-driven variables rather than baked on the client, right? It's an example of what we're talking about. It's a very limited example, but nonetheless. The social impact of that happened immediately, but that wasn't necessarily anticipated, was that guilds would build color-coordinated uniforms, right? That's an example of a social impact that comes immediately from enabling that small amount of server-driven stuff, right? And actually, that's a huge thing if you think about what is the social impact of uniforms. Like, they're everywhere. We use them all for all sorts of purposes. It has a huge cascading effect. What would go further? That was an example of only tinting colors, right? But what would be required in order to unlock fashion? Fashion is more than color, right? Fashion is incredibly important to human civilization. And yet, you can't do it in most games because you are confined to the handcrafted set of stuff, right? This is one simple example of tracing just, hey, I want to change the color of a shirt. But if you cascade it forward, through uniforms, what that means for social structures, into fashion and player expressivity and what that ends up meaning. What does that then unlock? It unlocks all kinds of social structures and commerce structures that didn't exist. And to make it super concrete, we currently build a huge amount of the free-to-play business today is built on the idea of fashion. It's built on the idea of having distinct cosmetic appearances, right? So in other words, it's a primary monetization engine for the industry. And yet, there's no support for it in the first place. Do you see where do you follow where I'm
Yeah.
going, right? It's actually a great example of one of those other economic things I've been thinking about a lot lately. What we often do as we pursue our monetization models is we're taking things that are by nature infinitely abundant because of digital goods and making them intentionally scarce through fiat, basically, in order to cause scarcity and affect price valuation, right? Which is weird in a way. Here we have the Star Trek replicator future, and we're saying, no, we don't want it. Actually, we'd rather play Monopoly, right? All of that cascades from these initial choices, right? These initial tech choices. And that's a really small example, right? So multiply that out to what does that mean if environments are malleable? What does that mean if you have a richer, more dynamic economy? What does that mean once you have a creator economy, right? All of these things start stacking. There is no creator economy without having some of this tech infrastructure, because there's no way for creators to put their stuff in, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, extrapolate out. You can see where that kind of thing goes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. It's the domino effect that it's not unique to games. You see it everywhere,
Correct.
too. Like with cars becoming a thing in the past, like the externalities were like, who thought that Walmart, would be one of the biggest winners of cars, and that has had a huge effect on society. And same with electricity, the internet in general, everything. So totally understand what you're saying. The ripple effects of what might seem miner can be super powerful, and having all of those things hit against each other at the same time too could lead to, I guess it just means that the creative surface area of what's possible and enables people to do is also um, pretty exciting
And
too. So
yes, and from a gameplay point of view, that's also more surface for fun. Okay,
yeah.
I don't think we should lose sight of that, right? Um, if you go back to the roots, it basically said the only way to have fun is kill things, which, it's a pretty horrifyingly
Yeah.
narrow view of the world, right? And then it's like actually killing things and helping your friends, right? Which is a nice addition, but we gain healing and we gain things like that. And then it's, oh, actually, it and there was resistance, but when in UO we put in crafting, competitors ran ads saying, why do you want to play to bake bread? Wouldn't you rather slay dragons? Right? But of course, the answer is, as we all saw through the pandemic, turns out a lot of people went to go bake bread, right? It is a thing that a lot of people want to do. So by enabling it, you are increasing the surface for fun. There's more fun to be had because there are more ways to play, right? Um,
Hmm.
and the practice of building static dedicated game servers against static dedicated clients with static and dedicated content on the disk or in your game install that's just a proxy for the disk, you are predetermining the kinds of fun to be had.
Right.
You're shipping a
Um,
radio with only that many stations.
hmm. Yeah. All makes sense. All super fascinating. Let's go ahead and switch gears a little bit and talk about the metaverse. And so, I guess first off, one of my favorite things I read last year was your series on how digital worlds work. Recommend everybody who's listening to go check that out. I'll link to it in the show notes. And I want to spend some time digging into some core ideas from that series. And I think a first good starting point is just the idea of interoperability, which, on one hand, as you've laid out, most interoperability isn't even desirable or even makes sense. And we've covered that too in places. So I think our audience generally gets that. But on the other hand, where it might make sense, it still requires data formatting standards, which create, as you say, a major social coordination problem to make that happen. So my question here is twofold. One, in your opinion, what are key interoperability challenges or needed standards in games that are worth solving for today? And then, second, related to that, to actually solve them, how should like leaders across the industry resolve any social coordination problems here? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, when this is one of those tools on the tool bench, right? If you're dealing with social coordination problems, there's basically two answers. One is you go full democracy, and you form committees and people, and you hope that the best standard, which will actually be the best compromise, not the best standard, ends up winning out through that kind of a process. The other is to enforce it by fiat because you control it. Those are the two ways in which standards get built. Um, in the real world, in practice, um, by fiat is actually the way most of the committee ones work. Right? Because the
Okay.
committees in the real world tend to be made up of the really big, powerful companies. And the really big, powerful companies say, well, we want to add WebP as a standard, or we want to say this particular mechanism of cleaning cookies as a standard, or whatever. And because they have 78% of the market, it is so. Okay. Most web standards today happen that way, right? Not because of some democratic process. Um, and that's because in practice, power is concentrated into the few who have sufficient market dominance, right? Apple says, Flash, die, and it does. Right? Kerpoof, right? On the democratic basis, Flash was nearly a standard. It was on something like 98% of devices. But on the fiat basis, boom, it died like in what felt like overnight, right? It was actually a protracted decade-long death, but it was done by fiat more than anything else. It was an exercise of power. So That fundamentally is the social coordination problem. We have a choice between, do we want to do this the democratic way, or do we want to let whoever has the most market share decide what the standards are? That's fundamentally what it is. Um, and, I'm a bit of a cynic. The people who run a given powerful company may be incredibly altruistic and idealistic at any given moment, but a company by nature is never altruistic and idealistic, right? It's not how a company works. It's how a manager might work, right? Companies
Hmm.
don't have such a thing. They just basically want to grow. That's what they do. So it's there's worries about having basically fiat be the way in which we set these standards, and probably the it's easiest to put it by analogy, right? At the last giant wave of, oh, let's have a bunch of metaverse standards, I attended standards meetings back in the mid 2000s during the virtual worlds boom, and I really remember, oh, it's going to be really easy, let's build an avatar standard. And everybody said, well, most of our worlds can import poser. So the poser format, has been democratically, and the poser skeleton, crucially. And that way we all have access to the huge library of poser animations. And I raised my hand and said, and when somebody goes to make My Little Pony world, what happens? You are assuming that avatars are in human form. What if somebody wants to make MMO StarCraft, which was a current example at the time? And it's just sort of like it's illustrative of the easy way in which we put blinders on, right, when we start making standards. And that, of course, is one of the drivers for standard proliferation. People invent a new use case and the previous standard doesn't work anymore. And that's why we have literally hundreds of 3D mesh standards, standard formats in use. When you get dominant providers of something, they typically end up developing internal formats to optimize for their offering, right? So both Unity and Unreal, you can bring in external 3D mesh formats, but internal they make their own, right? That's why you have to build and bake content, right? Is because in the name of performance, they have chosen a particular path, and that path is deeply tied to how their engine works, and as a result, isn't something that you can just easily share, right? So what that means is that when they say, oh, let's all go use NVIDIA's new format or whatever, they're actually talking about an import step, but it doesn't necessarily mean that assets are easily movable. They might still need baked to be able to move between engines, right? And, baking is not rapid. It's not teleporting from one world to another, right? It's actually, in many cases, hours of reprocessing the data. So yeah, all of those things are very real obstacles in terms of the social coordination problems. To my mind, the thing about standards, um, the big thing is to first agree on interchange formats. That's really the first thing that needs to happen. But that means that the hop around worlds trivially thing is not in the cards in the first stages. It's much more about, is it even possible to move this from A to B, right? Um,
Hmm.
and we've seen over the years in the game industry, even those basic interchange formats get thrown away routinely. It's not like we all build and transfer data with Collada anymore, right? Even though that was a thing, right? Um, yeah, it's a challenging problem. When I think of, for example, where did VRML go wrong? And to my mind, it was actually over specifying, right? Because if you over specify, like saying, oh, human skeletons always have this many bones, it's the kind of thing that you're closing doors that other people might want to go through, right? So that, to me, particularly now when we're in a period of exploration, we shouldn't be closing doors. We should be trying to open them.
Interesting. Let's go ahead and switch gears a little bit. We you mentioned we were hinting at this a bit earlier, but I want to spend some time talking about player ownership and player owned
Hmm.
economies. And as is the theme here, and with a lot of your writing, the devil is always in the details.
Yeah.
Like for what exactly does a player own? How exactly does the economics work? But a lot of the crazy noise aside, the crypto noise. I'm curious to get your pulse on player owned assets and economies in general. So I guess simple question to start: do you think they should have a place in the future of games?
Oh, there's should and there's can. And I'm sort of in this weird position where I come down on should, but maybe can't. And
Hmm.
that has to do with tech infrastructure as much as anything else, right? Um, to my mind, you cannot disentangle the notion of ownership from the fundamental fact that somebody else owns the server that embodies all of the ownership data. And that's similar to the problem that we've always had around what rights does a player have when they're operating inside of a given virtual context? What stake do they have in its governance, right? And the answer has always been, to our frustration, um, well, whoever pays the power bill for the server probably has that power. Um, you know, ultimately they control the machine, and therefore it doesn't matter what you want, right? Like they can always threaten to destroy the whole thing if you don't go along with what they say. That
Hmm.
dilemma has been with us for a very, very long time, and ownership, including the crypto models that are out there now, has yet to find a way around that. We just recently, a whole bunch of, I forget which streamer it was, but I think it's a couple actually, a couple of streamers recently took down movie catalogs from particular studios because their server side licensing deal ended. People had bought those movies and they are gone. Ownership, or was it a weird lease program, right? Um,
Yeah.
Fundamentally, if it's living on somebody else's server, it's always a weird lease program and never actual ownership. That is fundamentally the problem and the challenge. So even if you believe ownership should exist, the level of enforcement of it moves out of the technical question and moves into a legal framework. And that's where it gets just downright weird, right? So if we extrapolate, um, let's say that, no, I bought that movie. Oh, but we have to pull it down from our servers. Okay. Is there a law that says I have the right of download to move it to someplace else? Right? That's a legal question and would require external legal enforcement. I should have right of download, right? If we move over into games, hey, I have this sword. You sold it to me, but you hold it. How do you even download it? What is the player that can play that sword? I can at least import the downloaded movie and play it with VLC. What is the VLC equivalent for using that sword again? And the
Hmm.
answer is there outright isn't one. There, because again of the standards question. There is no way to extract that sword from its context. It literally stops functioning, right? It becomes some numbers in a spreadsheet that don't have value anywhere else. So that's the can you have ownership question. Um, it turns back into a social coordination problem, and it it starts intersecting, especially with challenges beyond, honestly, beyond the word ownership, because digital goods, by and large, don't fall under property law. They fall under intellectual property law, which is radically different from how things work in with physical objects. Um, and we just completely lack the legal framework to deal with it, frankly. Um, so it's illusory, right?
Hmm.
In the sense that all
Yeah.
ownership is illusory, but it is illusory in a very particular way that requires legal constructs to adapt and develop and actually start to support it. And until that time, it's mostly a mirage. right? Um, as we have seen with countless examples of services that sold you stuff and then went poof. There's no
Right.
shortage of those, right? So, does the vast metaverse future involve a picture of ownership? Sure, it should. It's a should. Um, but the can has a lot of can you questions that are not just technical, but
Right.
social and governmental, frankly.
Yeah, it's ownership with a lot of caveats. That I think a lot of with any hype cycle, it starts out pretty idealistic, and then reality starts setting into place. So um, I think those caveats will be increasingly understood by more teams and consumers. But yeah, the reality is there. It probably should change how many people think about building and owning these assets. We could talk a lot more about that, but one more bigger question for you before we wrap up. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on digital land, which I guess in some ways, many teams are trying to make that a type of ownable asset. And there's a long history of digital land in games, and today many people are trying to pioneer it in new ways to make it work across MMOs and the broader metaverse. So I'm curious, as you look back across your history with games that maybe incorporated land, like what were your biggest lessons learned over the years? And then second, what would you tell teams who want to incorporate land into their games?
Okay, so it's important to look back at the real world context of land, right? Land, as famously described in economics and so on, is the ultimate scarce resource, right? And it's because it is not only scarce, but um, the physical qualities of location provide very natural sorts of price variabilities, right? Um, so you kind of have a perfect, it's a perfect confluence of scarcity in very large volume, right? We have something that we know is scarce, and the scarcity becomes very apparent when you have density, right?
Mm.
Um, and you have location. Most of the time, it doesn't feel particularly scarce because if you just head out into the boonies, it's like, wow, there's way more land out there, right? So you have this interesting tension where you know it's finite, but you often can act like it's not. But then when you get into a dense situation, you feel the finite nature, and location matters a lot, right? Kind of the almost like the network graph of where it is and what it is connected to matters. When you move to digital land, there you have to question all of those assumptions. That's to start, okay? Um, when we build maps the traditional way, we now have a scarce resource, a finite resource that is also actually scarce, which is not the case in the real world, right? Like there are no boonies to go to if you build handcrafted maps. The boonies are suburbs in waiting because if you are successful, you will run out of land. That's a very different situation from, you know, like there's no Australia to go to. There's no, oh, let's all go move to the empty Sahara Desert or whatever, right? Like there is not that. So you start hitting those scarcity constraints way, 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 way faster. That's a big thing to bear in mind. The nature of incumbency with something like this is, we have other things in games that are scarce in that way, Veblen goods, collectibles, etc. But land is unique in the way that it preserves incumbency. Okay. And we know this because it was the basis of the feudal system, right? So the entire feudal system was heavily driven by land ownership and land not getting broken up very much and not getting disseminated to more economic hands as population increased, right? This is the engine behind countless like Regency romance novels. Oh, this is the younger son. Will he get any land or can he make a living? right? The answer is no, because it is all conveyed to the eldest and whatever. And so the younger son no longer has the income of a manor house with a zillion tenants who all farm and tithe to him, right? Like that kind of engine. Because basically capitalism is an accretive system. Okay, so in any free trade economy is what happens is primarily whoever was a first entrant or got lucky gets a slight advantage, and then that advantage lets them get more. So whoever got lucky early on and managed to claim the plot of land next to the river in the fertile land, the fertile farm fields, they're going to be slightly richer, which means they're likelier to swallow up the adjacent land. And that's how we ended up with medieval manors, right? That is the path. Somebody got lucky early, and think of it as a distribution. Theirs got higher, and they sucked away from what's nearby. So it's a concentration effect, right? Land really encourages that because what do we do on it? We build. We don't tend to knock down. And particularly if you are in a business of selling, knocking down is not something you want to make part of the process. We avoid in digital economies doing things like overextending supply lines, requiring maintenance cost, having decay, and so on. And so now you have a scarce resource that by nature is accumulative, and on top of that does not tend to get redistributed through turnover. Those things are all generally bad. They drive the Gini coefficient thing, right? That is a rich get richer scenario. A rich get richer scenario with a finite resource means that eventually, not that long, you will have new players who attempt to enter the game for whom owning land is impossible because all of it is owned, right? So that dynamic is fairly simple to understand. Of course, in digital, we have the ability to create more land, right? But just creating new land doesn't break the locality question. Just creating new land doesn't, if I outlined basically that there's scarcity, there's supply, and there's location. The fact that you can break one of those via digital doesn't mean that you've solved the other two, right? So among the things that we've run into historically have been things like, hey, we added more land. Yeah, but New York City is there and everybody wants to be near it, so the new land's worthless, right? And I think we've seen that. We're seeing that in some of the current land-based economies where people are going, why have this? In Second Life, we actually saw the inverse, right? We also saw the dynamic of, no, islands out in the boonies are worth more than being with the hoi polloi on the continent, right? It's sort of an exclusivity effect. And they actually monetize on the basis of that effect, right? So, so the location factor doesn't break. Ironically, digital has shown us that we don't need to have location factor, right? You could, instead of having continuous maps, have node-based graph maps, right? That's how the web works. And then, we don't say that, wow, eBay's website is closer to Amazon and therefore it is more desirable, right? Like it's not more desirable real estate because of that proximity. However, even disconnected node graphs end up with a geography, right? And for example, the DNS system gives us the equivalent of location, right? Good names are the equivalent of being in Times Square and having that as an address. So it's very hard to avoid some of these dynamics. The pitfalls, though, are really, ones that everybody should wrap their head around, right? Exclusivity of land is a problem if there are resources attached to it, because that will lead to rich get richer. And anybody designing these environments, I know you want to dangle getting richer as an opportunity to all of your customers, but rich get richer is bad. It is anti-fun, okay? And it's a key thing everybody needs to understand. You can have this, but this kills your game. Always, irretrievably kills your game on multiple different axes. So all games work to keep it like a this, right? You can in sports, when free trade phase happens or whatever, like, we don't let the winning team get the first draft pick to keep them from doing this. Like, there are so many examples. It's everywhere in the world. Okay. And you could take this as an underground argument for progressive taxation. Well, guess what? In a game, you need progressive taxation because this is always bad, right? You won't bring in new people if they don't think it's fair enough. Okay. So in the real world, we don't get to choose whether life is fair. In a game, we do. So all of these things, land is really is problematic, right? It has very real challenges around this. The flip side of it is the social value of locality is huge. An enormous amount of human culture is driven by density. Okay, it's just a key factor in getting us everything we like, frankly, right? So as you design, you need to worry about not letting this happen. Yes, causing density. A key challenge with expanding land infinitely is actually you destroy density. And that's a very, very big problem. If you create a system where you say, well, we want everybody to have their own land, and everybody ends up with an acre, nobody sees each other. Your game fails, even if you have millions of users. Right?
Yeah.
So you have to treat it as a very unique, special class of resource and constantly be monitoring how it is affecting not just your economy, but your social ties. But don't fall in the easy traps, because games do over and over. Have a finite map and let players chop it up. Doesn't work. First people in will be the dukes, and everybody else will be a peasant. That does not work. Don't allow resources that the game provides to be locked up by land ownership, right? Like, you don't let somebody build, if you have an oil well in the game, don't let somebody build a town on it, because whoever owns the house on the oil well will always be richer than everybody else, right? You're basically creating kingship whether you meant to or not. Don't just solve it by, have infinite space. Your user base atomizes, and then you don't get social density, right? Those are all common traps we've seen projects fall into.
Yeah, that was all brilliant and well said. And I hope a lot of teams listen to what you just said, because I think we're at a point in time where many should, because I've had the privilege of working with Lars Doucette recently. I don't know if you know Lars, Raph, but he's done
I know Lars.
a lot of
Absolutely.
incredible. He's a brilliant guy. He's done a lot of incredible thinking and work around digital land. And as we've been looking into a bunch of, especially more like blockchain based games that are raising a lot of money through land sales and putting really intense scarcity into effect. And again, kind of digging into that whole ownership question too. It's just been amazing to learn about the intricacies involved with what might seem minor is actually has huge implications for not just the value of the land or how people perceive land, but how people work with the entire game as a whole when that's like any type of real foundation to what's important. So thank you for extrapolating on all of that.
Sure.
We do need to wrap up right now. I could go on
Yep.
and all of this forever. I know you can too. But I guess last just quick question before I close. If people want to follow along with what you and the team are building and your thoughts on game design and building virtual worlds, where can they find you?
Sure. We do periodically post articles on playableworlds.com. You can follow us on Twitter at Playable Worlds, and that, every time we post new content, you can find that there. You can also follow me personally at Raph Koster, and raphkoster.com is where the archive of, at this point, 30 years worth of articles on these sorts of topics are all archived there. Millions of words, so if people want to ever check it out. I post all of my talks there as well, including links to videos and whatnot. So those are the places to go.
Awesome. And I highly recommend it. I'll put all of that in the episode notes. Raph, thank you so much for joining and sharing your wisdom with everyone today.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Thanks so much.
And awesome. And to all of our listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, please give us a like, subscribe, 5 stars. It would mean a lot. Also, to make sure to check out our free newsletter, Naavik Digest. And if you want extra premium research like weekly game deconstructions and market updates. Check out Naavik Pro. Links and discount codes for all of that, as well as the details of today's conversation with Raph, are all in the description. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.